Hi there, it's Wendy Hernandez with Command the Courtroom. Welcome to another show. So today we have Judith Rabinor, and I met Judy about 10 years ago when she was on my podcast. At the time, it was called The Family Law Insider, and she was on the podcast several times. If you haven't watched those videos, you need to, because we talked about befriending your ex after divorce, about co-parenting during the holidays. We had several interviews, and they were fantastic. So I was really happy when Dr. Rabinor contacted me recently, and we caught up. Lots happened in 10 years. And one of the cool things that has happened is she has a new book coming out, which I am almost done reading. It's called The Girl in the Red Boots, Making Peace with My Mother. So Judy's here with us. And let me just read a brief part of her bio because it's very impressive. And I want you to understand where Judy comes from. So Dr. Rabinor is a clinician, author, writing coach, speaker, and a workshop leader. In addition to her New York City private psychotherapy practice, she offers remote consultations for writers, clinicians, and families. She's published dozens of articles for both the public and professionals and has authored a few books, actually. A Starving Madness, Tales of Hunger, Hope, and Healing, Befriending Your Ex After Divorce, The Girl in the Red Boots. And she's a sought-after speaker and workshop leader. She speaks at national and international mental health conferences and runs workshops at spas, including Canyon Ranch. That's in Tucson, right, Judy?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, next time you come to Tucson, I have to go. Colleges and universities, including Harvard, University Continuing Education, and retreat centers such as the Esalen Institute in California. So welcome, Judy. Thank you for being here.
Wendy, speaking about Canyon Ranch, we could go together and offer a view on some of these topics from the legal point of view and the psychological point of view, like we're doing today, right?
Oh, I would love that. That's a great idea. We're going to have to talk about that and explore that idea.
We'll talk about that after the show, right?
Okay, awesome. And, so Dr. Rabinor is also, she's been on Sally Jesse Raphael. If any of you remember Dr. Sally Jesse. So we were talking about her before because of my red glasses. But anyways, today we're going to talk about the book, but we're also going to weave it into how it relates to some of the topics that we explore on the show. So, Judy, as you and I were talking about prior to going live here, I have a lot of viewers who come from dysfunctional backgrounds, dysfunctional parents, narcissistic parents, abusive parents. And, there's a couple of things that I see them struggle with. One, fear that they have turned into their mothers and or fathers, and that they are passing on these patterns of toxicity to their children and just continuing the cycle. Is that something that you've frequently seen in your psychotherapy practice?
Oh my goodness. Not only have I seen it in my psychotherapy practice, but I wrote about it in the book. But let me just back up for a moment and say that I wrote this book. I did not come from a really abusive family. I was not really neglected. I loved my mother. My mother was very ill at the end of her life, and I was devoted to her. And do you know how many times in my office I've heard, I love mother, but I love my mother, but. And so many people really struggle with assassinating her sometimes, feeling like I love my mother, she's wonderful, but she really can get on my nerves. And I thought, there's really not a category for this. This is not serious abuse, but a lot of people are kind of haunted. And I'm using that word deliberately. I was haunted by some of the things that went on between my mother and I that she did inadvertently, just like I did things inadvertently. And that brings me to your question. The fear of passing on patterns, we all inadvertently pass on the patterns that we were raised with. Sometimes we really struggle against them and we don't, but often we unconsciously just do the same things that we were raised with, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and I love that you bring up the point that, you didn't come from an abusive background. I didn't either. And my mom and dad, I think, did the best job they could. I know that they did. But, if there were things that I would choose for myself, I would choose differently. But the issue is that sometimes I'm not choosing differently. And I'm realizing that now reading this book, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm doing that.
Well, I think, we talked a bit on the show, and I would like to just give a good example because there are lots of parents out there listening. And I mean, one of the things, parenting is probably the hardest job in the world, right?
Mhm.
And we have to really expect that we're going to make mistakes. And I guess two of the most important words in the English language are I'm sorry,
Mhm.
and saying it like we really mean it. And I write about a day that I was on the beach with my daughter, and an old friend came by, and I wanted to talk to her, find out how her life had been going since I last saw her. And my mother said, my daughter was like 3 years old, sitting on the beach digging a hole. She said, just sneak away. Your daughter won't even know you're gone. And I was already in school studying psychology, and I was learning about attachment and trust. And I should have known, no, you don't sneak away. You say to your daughter, Mommy is taking a walk with her friend Barbara, but I didn't do that. For whatever reason, I listened to my mother. And instead of telling my daughter what I was doing, I did sneak away. Well, I get 100 steps away, and all of a sudden I get a pit in my stomach. I turn around and I see my daughter screaming.
Yeah.
And I run back to her, and she said, Mom, why didn't you tell me? And she was 100% right.
Yeah.
Now, my mother had her own attitudes about things. And one of her big attitudes that drove me insane was, we get over everything.
Yeah.
Like if you make a mistake, her attitude was, don't worry about it. We get over everything. In a way, it's true, Wendy, right? I mean, I'm sure you've gotten over a handful of things, and so have I.
Yes.
But I think parenting has changed since I was parented, and we're really encouraged to be more thoughtful about what we do so we don't create problems in our children. And that was a way that I just repeated a generational pattern. I did what my mother said. I didn't even think about it. And here I was a psychologist, right?
Yeah, that's right, Judy. And so you talk about in the book an experience that was a pivotal experience in your life about, and I don't know if you want to share it or not,
I'll
but
share it, but then I'm
okay.
not telling any more experiences because I want everybody to buy the book if I tell the whole
Exactly.
story. But the
Yeah.
book opens, and you can even, by the way, read this beginning on Amazon and some of the sites that give a sample chapter. So, what's in the sample chapter is I was in my 40s, and I was giving a workshop on mothers and daughters. And I was doing an exercise that I loved, which was really geared at helping people think about the love they had for their parents. And I wanted to normalize the fact that we can be both loving and angry. We
Mhm.
can be both loving and feel burdened by our parents. And
Mhm.
I do an exercise, and usually the image that came up for me was a picture of my parents. And my mother was captain of the cheerleaders, and my father was captain of the football players. And I idealized them for many, many, many years. And I usually brought up that picture of my loving parents, but instead, a different moment flashed into my mind. Okay, the moment was I was 8 years old. I was 8 years old, and I was all dressed up in a party dress. And I was on my way, I thought, to my cousin Winnie's birthday party. And somehow, on the way to the party, we stopped, and my mother dropped me off at the hospital, and I had my tonsils out. So I woke up the next morning feeling completely hysterical. My throat was sore. I'm lying in bed. I see my party dress hanging in a closet, and there's a nurse talking to me. And she said, You don't remember me, but I was here when they brought you up last night. And then suddenly I remember, oh, yeah, my mother took me to the hospital, and I remembered being wrenched from her, stuck on a gurney, the mask coming down over my face. And okay. And then my mother finally showed up she said, Your mother will be here at 12 o'clock. That's when they let visitors in. I mean, today is different. Probably having your tonsils out is an outpatient procedure, and or if it's overnight, parents are able to stay. And I was horrified. And it took me many years to say to my mother, why did you do that? Why didn't you tell me the truth? And she said, because that's what the doctor told me to do. Now, in all honesty, I do know that's true. The doctors back in the 50s and the 60s told parents not to tell the truth.
Mm.
But my mother didn't seem to get it, that this was extremely traumatic for me. And I'm using that word carefully. It was traumatic to think you're going to a birthday party and wind up in a hospital alone when you're 8 years old in a crib. And I remember that too.
How did that affect you? I mean, did that trauma affect you in your adult or your, as you grew up and as you became an adult and got married and got divorced and all of that?
Well, I have a friend, and she says to me, and we go kayaking together, and she says, she laughs at me, but we talk about how this is. I always say, let's check the wind before we take out the kayak. And she always says to me, and I always say, because we want to come back with the wind. We want the wind to be behind us when we're tired after we kayaked for a couple of hours. But she always says to me, the wind is unpredictable. We can't predict, even if we go out and we think we're going to come back with the wind behind us, the wind can shift.
Mhm.
So I think I lived in dread of the shifting wind because things could shift. And it made me lack trust and feel anxious and feel insecure. And that wasn't the only part of my personality, but that would pop up all the time. And that brings up another important point. I mean, much of my childhood was what I'd call normal. I came home, there were meals on the table, I had clothes to go to school, my parents put me to bed at night. But that incident, it just stuck with me. And there were other ways that my mother thought that secrets were the way to go. Now, when I was writing this book, Wendy, I think you read this part because you told me you read about two-thirds of the book. I wrote my mother's biography in one section, and I said, my mother was born in 1918, and that was a year before women got the right to vote. And I never understood how that fact influenced her life and a generation of women,
Mhm.
correct?
Right.
Women really had few rights. My mother did not work. Women had no financial independence. And staying married and letting your husband think he was the boss
Right.
was sort of the MO of most women at that time, and sneaking around behind your husband's back. My mother would tell me things like, "Don't tell your father. Don't tell your first. First. This is not in the book, but I remember her sneaking around, and we'd sneak clothes into the house. She'd say, "Don't let your father see these shopping bags. Don't let your father see these high heels," because my father thought I wasn't supposed to wear high heels. And later she would tell me, "Don't tell your husband how much those shoes cost."
Oh, wow.
Even after I was a psychologist and I was earning money, but that was a big theory of hers. Avoid conflict at all costs. And there was no awareness that carrying secrets is actually very burdensome and harmful, right?
Oh, completely. So, Judy, I think that for a lot of people, myself included, the choice between carrying secrets and being honest and potentially facing conflict, sometimes it's a difficult choice to make, especially if you're conflict averse. I mean, you're raised in a household where conflict was very ugly, or you're just a peacemaker. So how do people reconcile these two choices and move forward in the direction of not holding secrets but potentially facing conflict?
I know it's a really important issue that you're raising because on the one hand, in every relationship, people are entitled to privacy, right?
Mhm. Right.
So, for example, I mean, if there's anybody out there who's getting divorced, you may have gone to a lawyer without consulting your spouse, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
All the
yeah,
time. Yeah.
all the time. That's completely appropriate. I mean, you might want to go interview a couple of lawyers. I just had a case recently where somebody came in and she thought she was going to divorce her husband, but guess what? when she went to court and she found out what her husband, when she went to a lawyer, never mind court, and found out what her husband would be entitled to, she had to rethink that decision. She
Mm-hmm.
thought that she was going to get X, Y, and Z, and she was told by an attorney, oh no, that's not how it works. So
Mm-hmm.
having privacy under lots of situations and circumstances is normal. But it's when um, relationships are, I mean, that divorce is a separate situation because the relationship is about to change.
Yes. And and Judy, you bring up a great point there about, divorce, and which I deal with every day, and you probably do too.
I do too.
And, I don't want to reveal too much about what's in your book, but, talking about this woman and her thinking through what life is going to look like on the other side of divorce, I just want to raise that that's a point that people should look at if they're considering divorce.
Absolutely. I mean, people need to really get their ducks in a row and understand what their rights are before they think that divorce is going to be a picnic. Because even though you were divorced,
No, no, I'm not divorced.
oh,
Knock on
you were
wood.
never divorced. You just
I,
know a lot about divorce.
yeah, it's just
You're
because
like
I,
you're like the divorce wizard. But I was divorced, and even though I came out of my divorce really fine, it was much tougher than I imagined. And I suppose that's something that you try to really warn people about. That divorce is very difficult.
yeah, the divorce process itself is definitely hard. It's difficult. But then also, when like you talked about in your book, when you're used to having a partner pick up the slack, so to speak,
Right.
even if they're not the best partner, when that is removed, then maybe suddenly you find yourself driving on roads, literally and figuratively, that you're not used to driving on alone, right?
Literally and figuratively. That's a really good point.
Okay. So yeah, so talking about divorce, be sure and not just think about the process and how much it's going to cost and what lawyer you choose, but also, what's your support system afterwards? What's that going to look like?
Something I do now ask people about when they're contemplating divorce is, so before we go any further, now, I'm in an earlier stage than you because I'm in the therapy office and you're in the legal office, and by the time they don't get to your office right away, we hope they take some time and think about it. But
Yeah.
a good question I ask people is, so just before this goes any further, is there anything you would miss about your husband or about your wife if you got divorced? And that's a good question. It generally makes people stop and think. And by the way, that's a question I ask people who are feeling angry at their parents. And so
Mhm.
sometimes I'll hear, younger people say, oh, I don't want to go home for Thanksgiving. I can't stand going back to my house. I'm just doing it because I should. And I don't want to feel this obligation. I don't want to feel this burden. My brother drinks too much. My sister is jealous of me. They have a lot of reasons why they don't, and they can't. And if they start talking about all these people, and sometimes I will say, so do you ever think what you would miss about your family if you never saw them again? And that causes people to think, you know
Yeah.
and that's an important role for both of us in our two different professions, to help people really be reflective about big and small decisions in their life.
So yeah, that's a great question that you ask, and I probably should be asking that question of people when they come to see me more.
I mean, any couple who's ever divorced has faced that all of a sudden there are two kids, and that weekend they're with dad, and one kid gets sick, and the dad wants to take that kid to the doctor, but what's he doing with the 4-year old? Leaving him home alone? No, thank
Yeah.
you. And
Yeah.
having a good relationship with his wife, and being able to call her and say, can you come over, or can I drop Jane off, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, there's so much stuff. And then, and I think we touched on this years ago, just even homework stuff. Like my daughter has a little best friend and her parents are not together. And there's, issues getting on the same page as far as homework, and homework not being transferred from one house to another, and then the homework not being turned in. And then, the poor little girl is mortified. She did the homework, but she doesn't have it because it's still at somebody's house. This does require communication if it's possible.
It requires so much communication and collaboration between parents, and it requires parents being compassionate for their child. Their child is now caught in the middle of this thing with no homework. That's exactly right. Child going to school with no homework, feeling ashamed, feeling they're going to
Exactly.
get bawled out by the teacher.
Exactly. It's so difficult. So, and I want to loop back around to the question that you ask people who come to you and say, I don't want to go home, or I don't want to go to Thanksgiving because my family drives me nuts and blah, blah. So I would venture to say that every person in this world has some beef with their family. Like, it's rarely perfect. I don't know have you ever seen a situation where people don't have some issue with some member of their family?
Well, you bring up the most important thing is that my mother, she was, I describe her in my book as being uber optimistic. And she described her own parents as perfect. And that
Mm,
was really a big issue for me. And it's actually not a good thing for you to let your child think that your parents were perfect,
mhm.
because it gives your child a false sense of reality. No one is perfect. That is what you're saying. Everybody has things that they differ with about
Yeah.
their family. No family, everybody is in sync about everything. And letting a child know that, yeah, there are lots of things I don't get along with my brother or my sister about, but they're my brother or my sister, and I treasure, I honor that bond. We are tied together by blood, and blood counts. Blood is important.
So, Judy, okay, so there's a couple of situations that I want to ask with respect to what you just stated. So, first of all, say there's a situation where a person's family is not toxic, but they just get on a person's nerves. They just get on someone's nerves, and they don't want to be around the family, but they feel this obligation. Do you have any tips for people on how they can honor that tie and be around the family, but deal with these issues that are grating on the nerves, if that makes sense?
No, it does make sense. And I think sometimes just asking, um, there are a lot of different kinds of meditative practices that we all can use that help us calm down. So, like a simple meditation is just close your eyes, take a couple of deep breaths, and think about what life was like when you and your sister were little. Think about one positive thing that
Mm,
happened between the two of you. Can you remember a day at the beach, a day in the backyard? Can you remember the two of you ever sitting at the table that she wasn't being mean to you? And getting a person to really articulate the positive. You know, I'll tell you something interesting that I learned as a therapist, that we are wired to protect ourselves. The brain is wired to protect itself. So if you have a brother or a sister who really teased you or tormented you, you may find it much easier to hold on to that memory. It's
mm,
like your brain is telling you, don't let that person get too close, because they could step on you in a
mhm,
flash. And it's
mhm.
hard to remember the positive. But the brain is wired that way because we were once primitive animals living in the jungle where at any moment life could be cut short.
Right.
But we are not primitive animals. And, when you see people who are like furious because they're in a traffic jam and they're cursing at whoever's in the car and at whatever
Yes.
other cars,
I
right?
know some people like that. Yes.
Right. Not you and not me, right? Just other people we
No.
live with. But we know that those people are not really angry at the traffic. They're carrying an inner anger, inner turmoil about something, and they might not even know what it is, and that the traffic becomes the target. So, a
Yes.
person who has done something mean or wrong to you, we are wired to keep that in the front of our mind. But maybe we don't need to keep it in the front of our mind. Maybe what your sister did to you when you were in sixth grade has nothing to do with now. I have a client right now, and he had a brother who they were on the most terrible terms. He'd spend half of his sessions talking to me about how much his brother got on his nerves. He even brought his brother into a session. The pandemic hit. His brother lives a few blocks away from him. And life changed, right? We had hardly anybody we could be friends with. And
Mhm.
his wife got sick, and his brother came over and really helped him.
Wow.
Really helped him. And it didn't matter that when they were teenagers, all these things happened. They really did happen. So
Wow.
that was great. They had a second chance. And I
Yes.
love the notion of second chance, giving people a second chance, and keeping in mind that we're wired to remember the bad stuff.
Yes. So what happened, what you're saying is what happened years ago, or even maybe last week,
Yeah,
may not necessarily be relevant for today. It just may have been one of those things. I know I've not always been on my best behavior, and it's usually, like you said, not about the person, but maybe because I'm feeling stressed or whatever.
right,
Hormones, who knows?
right. I mean, and it is terrible because family schisms, schisms,
Hmm.
both pronunciations work.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know, like these family feuds that go on and on and on. And I think you started this by asking, do people take on the qualities of their families? Yes. Every time I've had somebody in my office that's telling me I'm not speaking to somebody in my family, a brother, a sister, a child, when I take a family history, what do you think I find? That there's a history of family alienation.
Oh, wow.
That they learned this from in the families they grew up, that if you don't get along with your sister, you can stop talking. By the time they get to their 60s, they don't even remember why they're not talking.
Yes.
But it's
Yeah.
really a shame. It's really a shame.
So okay, and so I want to honor you because I know you have a patient coming in 15 minutes, but
Yes.
so I agree it's a shame, and I love that story that you told about the brothers. Now
Yeah.
there are some situations where there has been abuse,
Yes.
like bad abuse, trauma that has
Right.
been inflicted. Would you distinguish those situations?
Yeah, there are some situations where you are better off never being in the presence of somebody again. And we hear this on the news all the time. We hear about really people who have impulse control and they go out and they do horrible things, and others in their environment were worrying about them. So there
Yeah.
really are people who can be dangerous, and even if they're not dangerous, like life threatening dangerous, they're dangerous psychologically.
Yes.
But it's something that could be really thought about, talked out, thought about deeply before a decision is made to cut somebody out of your life.
Yes. And that is best done probably with somebody like you, Judy.
It's true. It's true. It's true. Going to a therapist, and part of the reason going to a therapist could be good because a therapist is impartial. That if
Mhm.
you go to a friend or another family member, they may have their own agenda.
Mhm.
But if you go to a therapist, you hope you're going to pick a therapist who has your best interest in mind. And your
Yeah.
best interest is to stay safe psychologically, as well as physically. And yet, no man is an island, and relationships count. And to be alienated from a blood relative is a really important decision. Maybe that's what we should talk about next time, Wendy.
Uh,
What did you
uh,
say? What was the topic you raised before?
uh, uh, Estrangement, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah,
Familial estrangement.
yeah, estrangement. And you mentioned that you have you've dealt with this,
Yeah.
which
Oh, for sure.
people have to take members of the family to court in order to be able to see their grandchildren. Or yeah,
Yes. We can talk about that. I would love to have you back, Judy. And so thank you for spending the time today. It was great to catch up with you. I always am happy to talk to you. And I can tell you're the best therapist just from my conversations with you and from what I'm reading in this book. The way that you recount experiences with clients and the way that you work with them and establish a rapport and get them to trust you and share with you is just amazing. So
All right, let's try to do it once before the book. The Girl
Yeah.
in the Red Boots, Making Peace with My Mother, is going to come out May 4th.
Yes. So where can people find this book, Judy?
You can pre-order
Okay.
it right now on Amazon.com, or you can go to my website, which is Judith Ruskay Rabinor Ph.D.com. So you can either The Girl in the Red Boots on Amazon or on my website.
Awesome. So
Out May 4th, and it's a great Mother's Day present for anybody you know who has just a little baggage with their mother or someone else in their family that they love. Thanks so much for having me, Wendy.
thank you, Judy. And I think that's all of us probably who has a little baggage. And I can tell you
Everybody
that
has baggage. You're lucky if it's just a little, right?
that's right. I sat down to start reading this last weekend. I went through most of it in one day. It's awesome.
Oh, I'm so excited. I love hearing you say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And so, to all you out there watching, Judy will be back with me, and we're going to have some interesting topics to share with you. But until then, just remember to keep on trucking and get out there and command the courtroom. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time.
All right. See you soon.